What's going on, Junkie Nation? Gorgeous George and Goes are back with another superstar from the sport of mixed martial arts, UFC Hall of Famer, former light heavyweight and heavyweight champ. Now he does the commentary for the PFL. And of course, you know PFL's got a lot of fights coming up. 3 straight regular season weeks starting here in June, back to back to back. It should be a lot of fun. All of it on ESPN. And these fights, Randy, the finals are the finals, man. $1 million to the winner. That's awesome. The playoffs are great as well. But talk about this set of fights coming up. There's going to be some urgency for some fighters, which means a lot of them are going to sprint. There's going to be a lot of sprints here, less marathons, right?
Yeah. Especially you look at 155. There's a huge log jam there. A lot of 3 points, and some guys on the bubble. Are going to need to get some victories and some finishes if they have any hope of making it to the playoffs. But there's some great matchups, and getting into the second half, that's when it really starts the butt starts to pucker. They've got to get out. They got to go out there and they've got to perform. They've got to score some points, get some bonus points, and hope to be able to score enough to make it into the top 4 and make it to the playoffs.
5 minutes is a long time, right? At the same time, it can go fast. However, if you're on the receiving end of somebody putting you up against the fence, Greco-Roman style, Randy Couture style, man, that you're in a lot of trouble, right? But at the same time, how should a fighter look at this? Is it by what they should accomplish in the first minute, the second minute? Like, how much risk taking without being foolish when you come to game planning for a fight like this? Like, for example, Shane Burgos, we just finished with him, and he knows, both him and his opponent. They have a lot of urgency coming up here in their fight, Nishikawa.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And you got to balance that. You don't want to go out and be reckless and make mistakes trying to get the finish. It's a tough one. You really have to temper that aggression, take your opportunities. They're trying to create your opportunities as you can without being reckless and without putting yourself in harm's way. It's a challenge for sure. There's no easy way to do that.
Now that it's a few years in, I wanted to run something by you. We've seen the PFL do even 2 fights in one night in the playoffs. We've seen them do 3 regular seasons. But now that we've had a few under our belt, what do you think of this? What if they just start the year almost like Grand Prix style? Just grab 16 fighters, make a tournament, and that's it. Like, if you win, you advance, and if you don't, maybe according to how you do it, if you have to fill in through injury or something else, maybe your number gets called up again. But that's one idea. The other idea would be 3 regular season fights, and then now we take all those accumulation of points and we just get our best 2 and throw them in the final.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting idea, and I think their goal was obviously to create a true sports format that we're used to in every other sport, with a regular season, a playoff championship, and then a championship, a new title winner in each of those weight classes every year, and that's what they set out to do. Obviously, it was a little more complicated in the first 2 seasons when you had to fight, a 2-round fight in the quarters and a 3-round fight in the semifinal to get to that final, and they were allowing more people into the playoffs than the points required, and the number of athletes that were going to get into the playoffs were 8 instead of 4. So cutting in half in these last 2 seasons have made that a lot more challenging. Like you're saying, guys going into the second half of the season are definitely on the bubble. They're going to have to make something happen if they came up short in that first season fight. Lots of interesting ways this could go as we continue to grow and adjust. The sport and this organization is growing hugely, very, very fast. So obviously just opened the UK offices, had our first 2 shows over there, Newcastle and Berlin. Newcastle sold out. I haven't heard yet what happened in Berlin, but that's up and rolling. I'm headed to Riyadh, Saudi Arabia here in a week and a half to hopefully close a deal on PFL Middle East. Obviously, we know they just signed Francis and made him the chairman for the PFL in Africa. So they definitely got plans to open in Africa and start doing some shows in PFL in Africa. I met here in Vegas for the first 3 regular season fights. We met with a group from Australia that's very interested and has some very great connections for PFL Australia. So I think there's a lot of opportunity here to see this particular brand and this promotion continue to grow and solidify itself the way it is. ESPN's been a huge step up in exposure for all the athletes, and getting a lot more time on regular ESPN now instead of just ESPN Plus and ESPN2. Pretty impressed with where this is going. So your ideas aren't out of the question. I think there are some ways to continue to adapt and grow into this sport. I think as we start seeing more athletes getting hurt, not being able to make it in the playoffs, and I think that's one of the reasons why they moved away from fighting twice in one night, because you maybe don't always get the, alternates end up having to step in on some occasions, and that, that there's no continuity there. So I think there is some room, and your ideas are sound. Whether or not the companies want to embrace those ideas is the real question.
Hey, I know I'm a wacky guy over here, but if you guys need a spot on the board, I got lots of ideas. So you let them know, throw my name in the hat. Why are you going to Saudi Arabia? Are you the chairman of PFL in Saudi Arabia or the Middle East?
No, I'm not any of those things. I am a brand ambassador for the PFL, for the Professional Fighters League, absolutely. And
okay.
And so, as they try to finish up a deal with the royal family and all that, they're taking a couple of us over there with them, to hopefully smooth that out and help that happen and go well.
Nice. Okay. Very cool. You brought up Francis. You knew we'd eventually get to him. So he's part of Extreme
Francis
Couture
today in the gym. I just came from the gym and had a photo shoot with a sponsor, an endorsement deal that I have, and Francis was in there banging mitts with Eric. So he's definitely he's excited and getting back after it.
What's your reaction, and what's the biggest deal? What's the biggest thing from this huge deal, either that none of us have talked about or is not getting talked about as much? We know about, the opponent getting $2 million.
Yeah.
He's going to lead the charge for PFL Africa. He gets the options to box. I think I even heard the word equity in there, but is there stuff that you can also fill us in on that makes this deal even bigger than any of us ever thought?
Well, I think the big thing for Francis was the Africa thing, being the chairman for the PFL in Africa, and to foster and develop talent for the PFL from his country, where he came from, in not just Cameroon, but the entire continent of Africa. And obviously with Usman and so many others making a mark in our sport from that region now, it makes a lot of sense to get involved there, create some more opportunities for folks down there, build some more infrastructure, do some shows. That's going to encourage more gyms, more opportunities for more guys to train and develop skills and move up the rankings and into the professional ranks like Francis has done. And a pretty interesting story. I think that's the biggest part of it right there. He asked for some advocacy and athletes' voice from the UFC. They weren't willing to give any of that. And that's what led him to in a position to be able to have the PFL step up and give him some of those things that he really wants. The Athletes Advisory Board is something that we've started that, myself and Ray Lewis are on. I think we're adding Francis, and we need to really get that up and running. That's an idea that the PFL's had for at least a season now. So I think Francis getting involved, shining a light on that voice and that advocacy for athletes is the biggest part of this whole puzzle.
Randy, I know that's great for the PFL, for Francis Ngannou, for PFL heavyweights, but what about everyone else? Can you talk about how this might actually have a trickle effect for everyone else, and everyone else should probably be rooting for what just happened as well, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's certainly a lot of heavyweights coming up in free agency that realize if they're good enough and have the credentials to get into a fight with Francis, they're guaranteed a better purse than anybody else is probably ever going to offer them, which is really, really unique and an interesting thing that Francis negotiated for in his contract, for sure. And I think there's a ripple effect. I think we already got the attention of a lot of the other promotions. Why did shortly after we started giving away $1 million purses for our championship final every year, did all of a sudden the Grand Prix launch in Bellator, all with $1 million purses through their format and the way they got there. I think this advocacy, and obviously we got guys like Jake Paul, certainly Jon Jones is still chirping about Francis and wanting to fight Francis. Now, whether or not that fight's going to happen, I think there's a ripple effect in all these things that just happened that the PFL laid down that are going to affect the other promotions, and the fighters certainly are paying attention. And I don't think promotions like the UFC want that. They don't want that advocacy. They don't want a strong fighter pool with a solid voice. holding their feet to the fire and eliminating some of the BS in these contracts. That's why I'm a persona non grata with the UFC to this day. So I know they're all paying attention. You know, why is the UFC lobbying and spending millions of dollars to keep us from getting the Ali Act amended to incorporate all combative sports athletes? They don't want those sorts of things. They want to keep their thumb on the pulse of this sport and keep it right where it is. Be able to continue to pay fighters 12 to 15% of the take, not give them their fair share like every other professional sport in our society.
You know, you see names like Big Ben Rothwell, Fabricio Verdum kind of speak up and put their hands up. They'd like. I've never really ever thought there'd be people out there saying they want to fight Francis Ngannou, but there are names out
I
there.
know, right? Careful what you wish for.
I know, right? Who do you think? Like, are there any leading candidates, or is there anybody that you think would make a good fight?
Man, I tell you what, Ante Delia won last year's championship in stellar fashion, and he was very highly touted when we signed him. He struggled with the format early on, but I think he sorted it out. He figured out what he needed to do in his training and his preparation and his game planning to get through a whole regular season and make it to the playoffs and the championship. So, and that's a fight I'd love to see. He's a game fighter. He's a solid, well-rounded fighter. Him and Ante, Francis Ngannou and Ante Delia that would be a great fight. I would watch that fight, and I would pay a pay-per-view to watch that fight.
I want to ask you a little bit about some PFL strategies. George and I are racking our brains all the time trying to figure out, because every week is different and fighters are in different positions.
Yep.
We don't know what the hell to do. And we were wondering, as a gym at Extreme Couture, because this is so different from everything else, have you guys ever huddled up and said, we need to come up with some sort of PFL strategy for our athletes now that we've had a couple go through the system, and what works best as far as the training, how to attack certain situations when you're down in points, or do you have to be more aggressive or less aggressive, or let the fight play out? It's got to be a nightmare. As a gym, have you guys ever thought about like specific PFL strategies?
Well, I think there's absolutely specific PFL strategies going on. I've got a significant population of PFL fighters that are in the gym training and doing their camps now at Extreme Couture. Obviously, Taylor Gordado certainly comes to mind. I think she's getting ready to fight Jackie coming up here in one of these Atlanta shows. But we have a plethora of the guys that have committed and signed contracts with the PFL that are training in the gym. So I know that's something that's on Eric and Dennis's mind as they fashion those camps and try to help those guys not only get through that fight that they're staring at right then, but recognizing that they're going to have to turn around and fight again in 7, 8, maybe 8 weeks, 6 to 8 weeks, and managing it properly, mitigating damage in the fight if possible. Again, you walk that fine line, right? There's the challenge with this format. Going out and being reckless and trying to get that finish and putting yourself in trouble can then cost you. Now, how do you recover from that in your second regular season fight? There's a balance and a juggling act here that's another whole layer to the onion in an already very competitive and complicated sport.
Yeah, there might be something to the way Sadabusi and OAM go out there and perform, because they are, I think, keeping an eye on the big prize that awaits you at the end, minimizing risks and then taking them when they can. But the important thing is to get your hand raised and to be able to compete in 8 weeks later, 10 weeks later?
Yeah, 8 weeks. I think it's about 8 weeks now.
Yeah. So
at the end of my career, I did that a lot. I mean, I think my last 5 fights were in 18 months, and I shortened my camps during that stretch. That was the most active I'd ever been in my whole fight career. And I'd fought 3 times in a year before, but that was, and that was, I thought that was pushing it. But this is interesting. It's been fun to watch these fighters step up and embrace the grind, embrace the adversity of the regular season, and trying to get into the playoffs and do all that. It's been they've been doing an amazing job.
Since you seem to know about what's happening with Jon Jones and Francis, and I don't know if you peeked at Tyson Fury as well, I wanted to ask you, how long is Francis Ngannou the baddest man on the planet? That's what I call him. He was the heavyweight champion. He had defended his belt. He's no longer with the UFC. I realize that. He hasn't fought in about 18 months. He had that long injury and all that, and the contract thing. And now Jon Jones has taken, he's the heavyweight champ over there. Tyson Fury, boxing heavyweight champ. So they're all talking, but how long can he keep that? Do you believe that he's lineal? Like as long as he keeps winning wherever he's at, it's Francis Ngannou's unofficial claim?
I think he's lived up to that so far, and you know how it is, especially in our society. You're only as good as your last fight. You know, the fans are very fickle, and so you really have to block a lot of that out and just stay focused on what you're doing, what's best for you. I think Francis has done a pretty good job. I guarantee he didn't want to sit out for 18 months, but he definitely needed to get the knee fixed and get the rehab done properly so that the knee doesn't injure again. So again, you know, it's a really tough thing to say. It's like talking about who's the greatest of all time. It's such a subjective thing. I don't think there's an easy answer there. Yeah, I think just my perspective, it's silly for Francis to think he's going to step up and fight a guy like Tyson Fury at that level in boxing. It's like James Toney thinking he's going to step in at the level he tried to step in mixed martial arts. It's not going to go well. They have years and years and years of experience in refined boxing, which is different than what we do in MMA for boxing or kickboxing or any of that. If you can't kick a punch or take a guy like Tyson Fury down, what are you doing in there? You're going to have some serious problems. He's at the peak of his career and his skill set right now. I mean, look what he's doing with a lot of these guys. He's the predator and the top of the food chain in boxing right now. Do I think Francis could box? Certainly. Is he going to step in there with a Tyson Fury and be very impressive? Eesh, that's a big ask, honestly.
Well, Tyson Fury did say 4-ounce gloves. Now, who knows if he was just talking out of his ass or what? They have yet to agree on anything. I'm not even sure the camps are talking.
Still,
but I
even
did
with
say
4-ounce
this when
gloves, it's pure boxing, right? It's not MMA.
Right.
It's a boxing engagement.
Well, this is what I told an audience that we had on another show that we did. There was a time when Ray Mercer came over and he beat Tim Sylvia in MMA. And then obviously we had Anderson Silva go over there and beat Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. in boxing. So the unexplainable kind of has happened. But do you remember when Conor McGregor landed the one punch that he landed was an uppercut on Floyd Mayweather? But other than that, he didn't really hurt him. But he did land one solid uppercut. And all I was thinking was, with 4-ounce gloves, if Francis can land that, well, he almost sent Alistair Overeem to the moon. I give him a little bit more of a chance because he's a heavyweight than the old stuff you used to hear, like either Anderson versus Roy Jones Jr., Kamaru Usman versus Canelo Alvarez. No disrespect to those guys, obviously, but like we talked about, it's a completely different sport. But being that they're heavyweights, does he have just that much more of a chance?
I think he's always going to have that chance because he does possess that athleticism and that amazing power. We've seen it time and time again in mixed martial arts, get him out of trouble. I think you got to give him the nod there, even in a boxing match against a guy like Tyson Fury, because he has that power and that ability. It's always going to keep you in the fight, and I would suspect that Tyson Fury is not just going to poo-poo that. I think James Toney tried to say, "Oh, I'm just going to knock him out," and I think that anybody who's paying attention realizes that's not very realistic. And you better take his ability and his athleticism and his power seriously and box him proper. If you get squirrely with him, he could very well catch you and knock you out.
You're 59 years young right now. Your last fight was at 48. But this $2 million guarantee that the other guy is, because you're a huge name, if you weren't attached to Francis, to Extreme Couture, or if you guys could just put the friendship aside and do business, at what age would you have possibly considered this? 49, 50, 50? When did you finally go, okay, that's it? Because I know there was a point where you said, hey, if the number was right, you would come out of retirement. But when do you remember saying, okay, that's it?
When I walked away at 47, almost 48, that was that. It took me a year to come to terms with that and walk away then. Obviously when Fedor came back out of retirement, the phone started ringing because that's the fight everybody wanted to see when we were both in our prime. And I'm like, man, I'm 50 years old now. I'm not stepping back into and climbing back into fight shape and thinking I'm going to do that and not end up having to have a neck surgery or something pretty significant. That's what led me to stepping out when I stepped out. The discs in my neck from C4, C5 all the way down to T1 are just tired of my crap. And I don't want to have a fusion. Everybody I know that's had that surgery almost to a man has got no range of motion now, and they're still in just as much pain. So I'm
Yeah.
trying to do my best to avoid that. That's one of the reasons why I'm not competing in any grappling competitions or anything like that. I would love to be doing that, but I just don't want to have a neck surgery or anything that's going to affect the quality of the rest of my life. I've done it, and I don't need to do it anymore.
Yeah, and it was one hell of a career. How much have you, when you have trained with Francis, out of 1 to 100%, how much have you guys gone? You know, have you gotten to 70 or 80? What is it like to be in there? Is it like me and
I
Gunny
haven't
trying to move
honestly.
a
I haven't
refrigerator up
honestly.
3 floors and stuff, or something like that, or what's it
I'll
like?
tell you this story. You know, they in 2020, obviously the PFL took the year off,
Mm-hmm.
and they didn't want to mess with the. They spent a lot of time and energy building a platform. They didn't want to kind of half-ass it, frankly, you know, with the quarantines and everything else that was going on. So they said, no, let's just take the year off. In that year, they started the production company. They're, hey, Randy, would it be all right with you? We do a 4-part series on your career and you and where you came from and all that. And I'm like, man, that's flattering. That'd be amazing. Okay. Part of that, you know, they asked, you know, we're halfway through filming all of that, and they're like, hey man, would you go into the gym and train with the guys? And I'm like, yeah, I don't do that very often, but once in a while I do, and I'm happy to go in there. So I go in there. Of course, the first 2 guys I get paired up with are a little bit smaller, and that goes great. And then my 3rd round, I end up with Francis. Francis double legged the shit out of me. I mean, he just blasted me with a double, and I did not get back up the rest of the round. I spent the rest of that round underneath Francis trying to find the daylight again. And they're filming the whole thing. I'm like, oh, that's going to be great on film.
Wow.
But yeah, that's the only time I've really actually mixed it up with him. And again, this was while he was in that mode of shoring up his wrestling and getting ready to go out and fight Stipe again. And you know, hopefully have done the work to have a better outcome. And obviously he did. So you know, that was the mode he was in. Man, I have not been freight train doubled like that in a very long time. It was very, very impressive, and he's got a lot of power.
Did you
Last
play it
question.
off? Did you like say, and so that's how we build
I was
confidence
literally
in our
trying to
fighters?
survive the 5 minutes.
So this is the last question here, and I think we can rely on you because you've done it all, you've seen it all. You've signed a lot of contracts. Now, I know that a lot of fans are going to say, well, can't Francis and Jones co-promote? Like that rarely, if ever, happens. Bellator's done a little bit with Ryzen, Strikeforce back in the day. Chuck Liddell went from the UFC to Pride. Okay, so we've seen it a few times over 30 years. But one thing I always hear is, well, the first obstacle is each promotion has their own network and they don't want to. So that's the thing. You know, first of all, the promoters may not want to release the guys, but the other thing has to do with television. In this case, you're both part of the ESPN family.
Yeah.
So is it still kind of unrealistic, or is there maybe an opening for this possibly happening if both promotions can make a lot of money?
I think you make a good point in that the TV part of that, the network and exposure part of that is solved because both entities are on ESPN. I think the landscape of our sport and the contracts, the restrictive contracts in our sport are going to prevent that. The Fedor fight would have happened if if the UFC would have agreed to a co-promotion with M1 Global. They had agreed on money. What they hadn't agreed on was doing any co-promotion, and the UFC told them to take a hike. We're not going to put you guys over and do a co-promotion with you. I don't think the PFL has an ego problem like that. I think they would be happy to entertain a co-promotion between another promoter and themselves to make a big fight like that happen, certainly in the pay-per-view model that they're getting ready to roll out. So I don't think that's out of the question there. And like you said, I think the TV part of that has already been solved because we're both in the same place.
Man, I lied. I got one more. Can I give you one more?
Let it rip.
Okay. So maybe you can quell our fears. And I don't want to be a hypocrite and say, oh, they said or anything. No, honestly, this is what I feel. Because look, I appreciate what Francis did. 2 million to his opponent, equity, this, that, all these things, right?
Yep.
But I've also lived through the Elite XC era. I've also lived through the Affliction era. And so, some people got some handsome paydays, but then again, they couldn't sustain and then they went out. I don't want that. I love PFL and Bellator and one pushing the UFC. I like these opportunities for these fighters. So as much as you've been privy to from the business side, how can you quell my fears and anyone else that thinks, oh my gosh, this might be a little bit too much, we love it when they go into free agency, but this is a big fish they land.
Yeah, I understand your concern there. And they've done a great job in funding this and being very diligent. They are taking care of these fighters very, very well. I mean, Kayla Harrison right on down the line. In the regular season fights and in those championship fights, they're getting paid very, very well. They're taking care of them, and that's what needs to happen in our sport. And I think they're setting that example for the other promotions. Are they being a little, too frivolous, too giving? Are they risking, putting themselves in a financial? I don't think so. I think the people that are behind this and that are running this are very smart. They know exactly what they're doing. They've done a great job in raising capital. That's one of the reasons why we're going to Saudi Arabia here in a couple weeks. They want to bring more culture to that part of the world. That's why they just held the World Cup in Qatar. Certainly, money is not an issue for the people, the royal family and the people that run that part of the world. So I think that PFL has done a very, very good job of raising funds and using those funds appropriately to explode the way they have and grow as fast as they're growing. So you certainly hope they don't get growing pains and don't grow too fast, outgrow themselves. I think there's a genuine concern there. Got to be able to keep up with everything. But from what I'm seeing, and I get to see a lot of stuff behind the scenes, it seems like it's going very, very well. I don't have any concerns there.
That's great to hear. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for keeping it 100 with us like you always do. And we look forward to these next set of fights coming up here in June in Atlanta, all of them on ESPN. These fights will determine who moves on to the playoffs. Thank you, Randy Couture, for your time again.
Thank you guys both. I appreciate you both. Thanks for having me on. Great to see you both.